middle age. It's downhill from there. I mean, you're not going to live to 100. 50 is not middle age. Face up to it. Our young people, when they're in their teens, we should begin to develop them. They had me on the platform when I was 14 or 15, and they encouraged me, and we had lots of opportunity. We didn't start there. We start moving chairs and doing all sorts of things around the assembly. But everybody was responsible to train the next person coming along. When I was put as an understudy moving the chairs, you shouldn't have the old men moving the chairs in your assembly. Get the young people doing that. They can handle it. They may get the odd chair crooked, but you'll get over it. It'll be all right. That's the place to start learning, isn't it? Because if you get crooked lives, everybody's in trouble. You get a crooked chair, well, we'll get over it. That'll work out in the end. So you give people little tasks. That's what God did with Moses. Here's some 4-legged sheep for 40 years. I'll give you guys some 2-legged sheep a little bit later once you learn how to handle these. And that's how the Lord works with people. He gives them something that they can handle, and they learn the lessons, and then he moves them on to something else. So there was a brother a little older than I was, and he taught me how to do the chairs properly. And once he had taught me how to do the chairs, the elders moved him up to another job. He started to clean the emblems after the Lord's Supper. And then after a little while, I trained somebody, and then I moved up to something else. And they had us all moving along the little assembly line, learning tasks, learning faithfulness, learning how to be good servants in the local church, until eventually they began to see areas where we had ability. Now, I'm thankful in our assembly that they didn't say, we'll try you out on the platform, and if you blow it, we'll find something for you to do. That was never in their mind. They were taking young men out visiting, prison work, evangelism on the street, all sorts of ministries. And as we were doing all these things, they would say, you've got some ability in this. You should apply yourself to this. And so we began to see early on in our lives the direction the Lord was taking us. So I think that's how it ought to be. And I think we can help one another in discovering what our gift is. In other words, if I benefited from your gift, then I should be able to tell you that. And that will be an encouragement to you. Well, our time's just about gone. I did this on purpose, of course. This is what preachers do when they have a difficult text. They say, well, I'm sorry, we've run out of time just before we got to that verse. Not that I don't want to deal with these questions, but it's not the thrust of the lesson to deal with this. I want it to be positive and helpful and encouraging. And when we look at the subject of, for example, the gift of tongues, the Apostle Paul to the Corinthians, the only time we read about this, glossolalia, that the word dialectos is used at Pentecost. They heard in their own dialect. But this word, the gift of tongues, glossolalia, which the Corinthian church had, they were the most carnal church in the New Testament days. And they had the big issue with tongues. Paul says that tongues is last in the list. He gives that list at the end of 1 Corinthians 12, and he says, lastly, tongues and interpretation of tongues. So to think that tongues is some sign of great spirituality, the fact is that Paul said you're carnal, but you have no problem showing off with tongues. So we should never confuse tongue speaking with spirituality. That's not something that we would learn from 1 Corinthians. And even assuming that gifts were for today, listen to the list of qualifications that Paul gives. In the days of Corinth, they were speaking in tongues. And so he said, now here are the qualifications. There are 12 of them. Number 1, the manifestation of the Spirit is given to everyone to profit by it. All right? So in other words, when you speak in tongues, make sure that everyone is profiting by it. That's number 1. That would blow most tongue speaking right out the door, wouldn't it? Make sure that everyone is benefiting from your exercise of gift. And if your gift is tongue speaking, make sure everybody's benefiting. That's why Paul said, I would rather speak 5 words that people understand than 10,000 words that people don't understand. Now 10,000 is the largest number in Greek. And so he used the largest number, and he said that's the proportion. Far better to use 5 words that people benefit from than 10,000 words that people don't benefit from. Then number 2, that there be no schism in the body. The gifts are to be used in such a way that they don't cause division in the body. You know, this is the number one cause of division in the evangelical church around the world. So we have to ask ourselves again the question, even supposing tongues were used today, they should never be used in such a way that they cause division among the people of God. Number 3, do all speak with tongues? The answer is no. I mean, it's a rhetorical question. The answer is obviously no. So the idea that everyone has to speak in tongues to prove that they have they're spiritual people, they have the Spirit of God, is absolutely not true. It is to be to the edifying of the church, not for my own edification, right? This is what Paul says. When you speak in tongues, you're edifying yourself. That is not the purpose of gifts. The purpose of gifts is for the edification of other people, not for my own edification. I don't preach for me. The evangelist doesn't evangelize for himself. The person who gives doesn't give for their own benefit. Every gift is designed for the well-being of other people, for the upbuilding of the church. And so if tongues is for self-edification, as Paul says it is, well then it's not appropriate. It should contain words that have significance, verses 7 to 11 of 1 Corinthians 12. In other words, the words that are spoken have to make sense to somebody. They have to be sensible words. They're not gibberish. An interpreter must be present and must function as a qualified, legitimate translation of what has been said. It has to be verifiable. And then tongues are for a sign not to those who believe, but to those who believe not. Now, that was true in every case. You know, it's possible to be a Christian and not be a believer. In the case of the Christians in Jerusalem who didn't believe that Gentiles could be saved the same way that Jews were. Remember, it's a sign to the Jews. And so when tongues were spoken by the people in Cornelius' house, the first Gentiles to be saved in the church age, Peter came back to Jerusalem and he said this, the same thing happened to them as happened to us at the beginning. He was convincing them they were not believers. They didn't believe that these Gentiles were the same as they were. And so the tongue speaking was an evidence to these Jews who were Christians, but they just didn't believe that the Gentiles were on the same footing as the Jews. And so it was a message consistently throughout the Scripture. The tongue speaking is not for believers. It's to convince those who are not believers. It's a sign, it's an evidence that is given. And so says Joel 2. Tongues were to be 2 or 3 at the most. In a public gathering, there were to be 2 or 3 at the most that spoke in tongues. So says verse 27. And only one at a time, not jumping all over each other, 2 or 3 people talking at the same time, or 20 or 30 or 200 and 300. It says, and that by course. In other words, one after the other. It was very orderly. And then the Scripture says the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. It was not something that just sort of hit them, you know, where they couldn't control it. It just happened. I mean, when I get up to preach, it doesn't just sort of happen. Like, oop, here we go. Sorry, folks, I can't help myself. No, my spirit is subject to this. And the same is true in every case. I mean, some people wish that those with the gift of giving couldn't control it, but you know, they do control it. Every gift is controlled by the spirit of the person who has it. And so tongue speaking is not something that just sort of comes over you and you just do it and you can't help yourself, because you're going to give an account for your gift and how you use it. And so it's not something that just hits you out of the blue. And then verses 34 to 35, right in the context, women are to be silent in the public gatherings of the church. No women were to speak in tongues audibly. No siree. I want to tell you that most of the modern charismatic movement would stop if the women couldn't speak. And so Paul finishes off this list of 12 requirements for the proper use of tongue speaking in Corinth, in the day in which it was still valid, still being used, and he said, let all things be done decently and in order. So if you took those 12 and put them up on the wall, you'd never have another problem with it. because it's so